Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one: immigration. It's constantly in the headlines, touches on so many things: personal stories, politics, the economy. You hear about it all the time. But we're going to try something a little different today. We're not focusing so much on the anecdotes, as important as those are. Instead, we're zoning in on something specific, something often debated: the financial side. What's the impact of illegal immigration on public resources? On taxpayers like you. We'll be drawing heavily from analysis by Stephen A. Camarota. He's the director of research at the Center for Immigration Studies and, other credible sources too, to really unpack the numbers. So the big question for us today is, what does it really mean when you hear illegal immigration described as a net fiscal drain? What are the actual costs? What about the contributions? How does it all balance out? Our goal here is just to give you a clear, fact-based understanding, to get behind the headlines.
Yeah, that's absolutely the core question, isn't it? And this term, net fiscal drain, it sounds technical, maybe even loaded, but the sources define it pretty simply. It's basically an accounting thing. It just means that, on average, a group takes out more in government services and benefits than they put in through taxes.
Oh.
Over a certain time, of course. Think of it like the government's checkbook for a specific group. Money in from taxes, money out for services. A drain happens if the money out is consistently more than the money in.
So it's a balance sheet, basically, for public funds. Are the taxes paid covering the services used? Or is there a gap?
Exactly. And what's really important to stress, and the analysis makes this clear, is that this isn't about judging anyone's willingness to work. That's not the point. The sources acknowledge that illegal immigrants are working, they're employed, often in vital sectors, and they do pay taxes: income tax, payroll taxes, sales tax when they buy things, property taxes sometimes indirectly through rent, all of that.
So they are contributing financially.
Definitely. The net fiscal drain concept isn't trying to ignore that. It's looking at the overall picture. It tries to calculate everything, the contributions and the consumption of public services, and see how it nets out for government budgets. It's the whole financial footprint.
Okay, so let's talk about a big number that often comes up in these discussions. The research mentions this figure: each illegal immigrant creating a lifetime fiscal drain averaging around $68,000. That sounds like, well, a lot.
It is a striking number, no doubt. And it's important to understand how they get there. It's calculated using something called net present value, or NPV. Now, NPV, for anyone not familiar, it's a way economists look at future money. Basically, a dollar you expect to spend or receive, say, 20 years from now, isn't worth the same as a dollar today, right?
Yeah.
Because of inflation, investment potential, stuff like that.
Time value of money.
Exactly. So NPV discounts those future costs and benefits back to what they'd be worth in today's dollars. It lets you compare costs and benefits across a long time span on an equal footing.
Okay, so it's adjusting for the fact that future costs aren't quite as immediate or impactful as costs right now. It's the present value of that lifetime stream of costs and contributions.
Precisely. And here's a really critical detail the sources point out. That $68,000 figure, it's with the NPV discounting. Without using NPV, they state the actual undiscounted net lifetime fiscal drain would be much larger.
Wow. So $68,000 might actually be a conservative estimate of the total dollars involved over a lifetime if you didn't apply that discount.
That's what the analysis suggests, yeah. It implies the future costs, when just added up year after year without discounting, would result in a significantly higher total fiscal imbalance. So the $68,000 represents the burden translated into today's terms, but the raw future costs are even higher.
Okay, that definitely adds context. So
Yeah.
why? Why this imbalance? If they're working and paying taxes, what's the main reason the sources give for this net fiscal drain?
The sources point pretty directly to one primary factor: the average education level. There's a significant difference highlighted in the research. It suggests that about 69% of adult illegal immigrants lack education beyond high school. That's, almost 7 out of 10.
And how does that compare to the U.S.-born population?
Well, for the U.S.-born, the figure is around 35%. So it's roughly double the rate, 69%, versus 35% lacking education past high school. A very stark difference.
Okay, a big gap in educational attainment. How does that specifically lead to the fiscal drain, according to the analysis? What's the connection?
It creates a kind of chain reaction, economically speaking. Lower average education levels generally correlate with lower skilled jobs. And lower skilled jobs typically mean, well, more modest earnings. Lower earnings then mean lower tax contributions. You pay less in income tax, less in payroll taxes if your wages are lower.
Right, makes sense.
And then on the other side of the ledger, those same lower incomes, especially combined with potentially larger family sizes, often make individuals and their families eligible for various means-tested public programs.
Ah, okay. So programs designed to help low-income households.
Exactly. Things like Medicaid for healthcare, SNAP, what used to be food stamps for food assistance, maybe subsidized housing, TANF, Head Start for Kids,
Mm,
programs like that. So the core of the fiscal drain, according to this analysis, comes from this combination. Lower tax payments going in due to modest earnings, and higher use of publicly funded services coming out due to eligibility based on those lower incomes. It's fundamentally linked to that education earnings connection.
got it. Lower education leads to lower income, which means less tax paid and more services needed. Okay. So let's shift gears slightly and talk about the sheer number of people, because the context here is also about population size, and recent changes have been dramatic. The latest estimates put the illegal immigrant population at around 12.8 million as of October 2023. That's a huge number of people. Roughly the population of Pennsylvania, maybe.
Yeah, it's a very large population. And what's really striking, as the sources emphasize, isn't just the total number, but the speed of the recent increase. That 12.8 million is up from an estimated 10.2 million in January 2021. That's an increase of 2.6 million people in, what, less than 3 years?
2.6 million in under 3 years.
Right. And according to the sources, that rate of growth is unprecedented in the data they use specifically. The current population survey data that started tracking citizenship regularly back in 1994. They mentioned a blip during the early COVID pandemic that messed with data collection. But apart from that specific disruption, we haven't seen growth like this fast in that data set before. It's historically very unusual.
Unprecedented growth. That really stands out. Okay, so how do the sources account for that surge? Where did that extra 2.6 million people come from in the data since early 2021?
The analysis breaks it down into two main components. First, they estimate that approximately 2.7 million inadmissible aliens were released into the U.S. during that period. Inadmissible aliens basically means people who arrived at the border or were caught between ports of entry and were determined not to meet the legal requirements to enter. But for various reasons, capacity issues, asylum claims, specific parole policies, they were released into the country anyway, often with instructions to appear in court later.
So they're physically here, but without legal status, and their entry was processed or recorded in some way. That's 2.7 million. What's the other part?
The second component is an estimated 1.5 million individuals who entered undetected. These are often referred to as gotaways. These aren't people who were processed. These are estimates based on signs of entry things, sensor alerts, camera footage, tracks found where Border Patrol didn't actually apprehend anyone. It's an estimate of those who slipped through without contact.
Okay, so 2.7 million released plus 1.5 million estimated gotaways. That adds up to more than the 2.6 million net increase. There must be outflows too, right? People leaving, deportations, adjustments of status.
Exactly. There are always outflows, people leaving voluntarily, deportations, some obtaining legal status, and sadly, deaths. So the 2.7 million released and 1.5 million gotaways represent the inflows contributing to the growth, while the net increase of 2.6 million reflects those inflows minus the outflows during that same period.
Right, right. The key point being that inflow has been exceptionally high. And for you listening, it's important to realize this isn't just a national number. This kind of rapid growth has real immediate impacts on communities on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. It puts immense strain on local infrastructure and services. Think about schools. A district might suddenly have hundreds, maybe thousands of new students, many needing language support or other specialized services. Where does the funding come from? How do you find the space, the teachers?
And healthcare too, I imagine.
Yeah.
Housing.
All of it. Increased demand for emergency room services, which we'll get to, pressure on affordable housing, potential increases in homelessness or overcrowded living situations, strain on food banks, social services. Local governments find themselves needing to stretch resources very thin very quickly. It forces really tough decisions about resource allocation across all essential community needs.
Okay, let's dig into those specific costs now. Starting with welfare programs, you mentioned eligibility. What do the numbers actually show about usage rates and the cost?
The data presented is pretty stark here. The sources state that 59% of households led by illegal immigrants use at least one major welfare program. Now, compare that to U.S.-born households. Their usage rate is reported at 39%, so it's significantly higher for households headed by an illegal immigrant.
59% versus 39%, that's a 20 percentage point difference. And what does that translate to in terms of dollar cost?
That higher usage rate adds up. The estimate provided is approximately $42 billion annually in welfare benefits going to these households.
$42 billion a year. Okay, but let's clarify how they are eligible, because this trips people up. If the adults don't have legal status, How can the household access these programs?
That's a really key mechanism the sources explain. Often, the eligibility flows through their U.S.-born children. Remember, under the 14th Amendment, children born in the U.S. are citizens, regardless of their parent status. And as citizens, these children are eligible for various public benefits.
So the parents might apply for benefits on behalf of their eligible citizen children.
Exactly. The household can access programs like SNAP, Medicaid, CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, because the children qualified directly. And the sources even mention that in some specific cases, like federally subsidized housing, eligibility might only require one family member, like a U.S.-born child, to qualify for the whole household to receive the benefit. So it's not always direct benefit to the non-citizen adults, but the family unit accesses these publicly funded services through the eligible members, primarily the kids. That's how a large part of that $42 billion cost accrues.
Okay, that clarifies the mechanism. Now, let's move to another huge area of cost, public education. You mentioned the strain on schools. What are the numbers associated with that?
Education is a massive item. The estimates indicate there are approximately 4 million children of legal immigrants attending public schools K through 12 across the country. Educating these children costs taxpayers an estimated $68 billion annually.
$68 billion. And you mentioned earlier that this might be an underestimate now.
Correct. The sources are careful to point out that this $68 billion figure is based on enrollment before accounting for the really large recent surges we discussed, particularly post-January 2021. So given that huge influx, the actual current cost is likely higher, maybe significantly higher. It takes time for education cost estimates to catch up with rapid enrollment changes.
So we're talking potentially well north of $70 billion a year just for K-12 education for these children. What does that mean for schools and other students?
Well, for you listening, imagine your local school district. This kind of influx means larger class sizes, right? It means a greater need for specialized resources. ESL teachers, translators, counselors familiar with immigrant experiences, maybe additional social support services. If funding doesn't keep pace, and often it doesn't, districts have to make really tough choices. Maybe they get arts programs or delay infrastructure maintenance or can't hire enough support staff. It stretches resources thin and can impact the quality of education and the school environment for all students in those systems. It's a major financial and logistical challenge.
Definitely. Okay, one more major cost category. Healthcare, specifically emergency medical services. What's the situation there?
This is another significant area. The sources estimate there are about 5.8 million uninsured illegal immigrants. And because they lack insurance and often regular access to primary care, they frequently rely on emergency rooms when they need medical attention.
Even for things that aren't necessarily emergencies.
Sometimes, yes. The ER becomes the provider of last resort. And federal law, specifically EMTALA, requires hospitals receiving Medicare funds, which is most hospitals, to screen and stabilize anyone presenting with an emergency condition, regardless of their ability to pay or their immigration status. This reliance by 5.8 million uninsured individuals translates to estimated annual costs of over $7 billion for taxpayers.
$7 billion. And how does that cost get covered if the patients are uninsured and often can't pay?
Well, largely it becomes uncompensated care for the hospitals. Hospitals absorb these costs initially, but ultimately they get passed on. They're covered through a mix of government subsidies meant to offset uncompensated care, but also through higher charges for services to insured patients, meaning higher insurance premiums for everyone else, and ultimately through taxes that support those government subsidies.
So it ripples through the whole healthcare system.
It absolutely does. It strains hospital budgets, especially safety net hospitals. It can contribute to longer wait times in emergency rooms for everyone. And it fuels that bigger debate about healthcare access, insurance coverage, and how to pay for necessary care for all residents without bankrupting the system or overburdening taxpayers. It's a real pressure point.
Okay, so we've laid out some pretty substantial costs. $42 billion for welfare, $68 billion for education, over $7 billion for emergency medical. Now, let's bring it back to the other side, the contributions. We need to be balanced. They work, they pay taxes. What's the estimate for their tax contributions?
Right. Absolutely crucial to look at both sides. The sources estimate that illegal immigrants contribute about $25.9 billion annually in taxes. And again, that includes various types, federal, state, local income taxes, where applicable, payroll taxes like Social Security and Medicare, sales taxes, even property taxes indirectly through rent. It's a significant sum reflecting their participation in the economy.
$25.9 billion. Is there an underlying assumption about how many are working formally versus informally?
Yes. The analysis provides a key assumption for that figure. It's based on the idea that 55% of illegal immigrants work on the books, meaning just over half are in jobs where taxes are formally withheld and reported. This acknowledges that, yes, a substantial portion, maybe close to half, likely work in the informal economy or off the books, where tax collection is much more difficult or non-existent.
So it's trying to account for the reality of employment patterns. And does this estimate align with any past research?
The sources briefly mentioned that the Social Security Administration itself did research back in 2013, estimating that illegal immigrants paid about $13 billion into the system then. So while the numbers change over time, the fact that they do contribute through taxes isn't really in dispute, and it's something researchers have tracked for a while. The current $25.9 billion estimate reflects updated population and economic data.
Okay, $25.9 billion in contributions. Now, the direct comparison. How does that stack up against the costs we just detailed?
Well, this is where the net fiscal drain concept really crystallizes. If you take that $25.9 billion in estimated annual tax contributions, and you compare it to the costs, just the three big ones we detailed, $42 billion for welfare, $68 billion plus for education, $7 billion plus for emergency medical less, you can see the gap immediately.
Yeah, the costs in just those three areas add up to, what, over $117 billion, compared to about $26 billion coming in.
Exactly. The contributions, while substantial in their own right, are estimated to be insufficient to offset the consumption of these major public resources. That difference, that shortfall, is the net fiscal drain the analysis describes. It makes the concept very tangible when you put the numbers side by side like that.
That's very clear. But there's another common argument you hear that even if there's a fiscal drain on government budgets, illegal immigrants contribute a lot to the overall economy, to GDP growth. How do the sources handle that point?
That's a really important distinction, and the sources address it directly. They acknowledge that illegal immigrants do contribute to economic activity and GDP growth. The estimate cited is that they add approximately $321 billion to the U.S. GDP annually. That reflects their labor, their consumption, the businesses they might support or even start. Their work in sectors like agriculture, construction, hospitality certainly adds to the total economic output of the country.
So they make the economic pie bigger overall.
They do contribute to making the pie bigger, yes. However, the sources strongly cautioned against confusing that GDP contribution with fiscal responsibility or a positive impact on government budgets.
Okay. Explain that difference. Why isn't contributing to GDP the same as being fiscally neutral or positive?
Think of it this way. Economic activity, GDP, measures the total value of goods and services produced. Fiscal impact measures the effect on the government's wallet taxes in versus services out. Someone can be very productive, adding value to GDP, but if their wages are low, they might pay very little in taxes while simultaneously qualifying for significant public assistance, healthcare, food aid, education for kids. So their economic contribution is positive in terms of output, but their fiscal impact on the government budget might still be negative, a net drain. Adding to GDP doesn't automatically mean you're covering your share of public service costs through taxes.
That's a critical distinction. So the focus of this analysis, the net fiscal drain, is purely on that government budget aspect, not the broader GDP effect.
Precisely. While the GDP contribution is real and acknowledged, the core argument about the fiscal drain centers on the direct balance of taxes paid versus government resources consumed. The two things measure different aspects of economic impact.
Okay. This really seems to bring us back to something we discussed earlier, the role of education. If that's the main driver linked to lower earnings, lower taxes, and higher service use, let's revisit that.
Yes, it's worth circling back because the sources consistently tie the fiscal outcomes to education. That disparity, 69% of adult illegal immigrants lacking education beyond high school versus 35% of U.S. born, isn't just a statistic. It's presented as having direct, ongoing fiscal consequences. Lower education attainment is linked directly to lower lifetime earnings potential. That means lower tax contributions over a whole career. And it simultaneously means a higher probability of needing to rely on means-tested social safety net programs at various points or continuously. It's positioned as the fundamental factor shaping that fiscal imbalance.
So if education is so central to this fiscal picture, does the analysis offer any hints about policy directions? What might address this core issue?
Well, the analysis itself focuses mainly on quantifying the problem, but the findings strongly imply certain policy considerations. If low education is the root issue driving the fiscal drain, then policies aimed at enhancing workforce skills and educational attainment among immigrant populations seem like a logical direction to explore.
Things like adult education, job training.
Exactly. Investing in things like adult basic education, GED programs, vocational training tailored to in-demand jobs, robust English language instruction. The idea is that improving skills and credentials could lead to better jobs, higher earnings, and therefore increased tax contributions over time. It would also likely reduce reliance on public assistance programs as incomes rise. It's framed as addressing the root cause, aiming for long-term integration and economic self-sufficiency.
That makes sense, but it also sounds like a potentially massive long-term investment itself.
Oh, absolutely. It wouldn't be cheap or quick.
Hmm.
There's a significant upfront cost to implementing widespread education and training programs, and the fiscal benefits, the increased tax revenue and reduced welfare costs, would likely take years, maybe even decades, to fully materialize. But the implication is that focusing on human capital development could be a strategy to mitigate the fiscal drain in the long run.
Okay, so bringing this all together now, we've looked at the numbers, the costs, the contributions, the underlying factors like education. How does this kind of detailed fiscal analysis fit into the larger, often very passionate national conversation about immigration?
What this analysis by Camerota and similar research does is inject a specific, data-driven perspective into that debate. It highlights the tangible financial implications for taxpayers and government budgets. By putting numbers on welfare use, education costs, healthcare burdens, and comparing them to tax contributions, it quantifies one major dimension of the issue. It moves the discussion, at least partially, away from purely emotional or anecdotal arguments and forces a consideration of the economic realities and resource constraints. It contributes significantly to the debate about policy choices, resource allocation, and the long-term fiscal health of communities and the nation. It provides concrete data points for policymakers and the public to grapple with. Exactly. It pushes everyone involved to weigh these fiscal impacts alongside other important considerations: economic needs, humanitarian concerns, legal principles when thinking about immigration policy. It adds a crucial, if sometimes uncomfortable, layer of quantifiable information to a very complex national discussion.
This has been incredibly informative. We've really unpacked that term net fiscal drain, seeing it as an accounting of taxes paid versus services received. We saw the lifetime estimate of $68,000 per person using that conservative NPV method. We linked it strongly to the lower average education levels reported for illegal immigrants compared to the U.S.-born population, which leads to lower earnings and higher use of public services.
Right, and we discussed the unprecedented recent growth in the population, hitting 12.8 million, driven by both releases at the border and gotaways, placing real strain on local communities. We broke down the big costs: $42 billion for welfare, $68 billion plus for K-12 education, over $7 million for emergency medical, and saw how they stack up against the estimated $25.9 billion tax contributions.
Highlighting that clear fiscal shortfall while also being careful to distinguish it from the separate issue of GDP contribution. And we touched on how education remains a key factor, suggesting potential long-term policy focus on skills development. Our goal, as always, was to give you the facts, the context, the numbers from the sources so you can form your own informed perspective.
So, as you think about everything we've discussed, the real economic contributions through labor, the simultaneous and significant cost to public services, the underlying factors, we want to leave you with a final thought to consider. Given this detailed fiscal picture and acknowledging the human elements involved, what does this mean for how we as a society should try to balance humanitarian concerns and human dignity with the very real imperative of fiscal responsibility when we shape our immigration policies for the future?
How can this factual understanding help inform your own views on what sustainable and fair immigration policy looks like? It's a complex question with no easy answers, something to reflect on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable.